Thank you so much for joining us for today's important discussion, Bridging the Digital Divide, Advancing Indigenous Digital Equity Through Partnership. My name is Michelle O'Keery, and I have the privilege of serving as the Executive Director of the Indigenous Prosperity Foundation. Let me begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you today from Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton, Alberta, the traditional lands of the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, and Nakota Sioux peoples, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. I pay respect to the many Indigenous nations who have walked these lands for generations. And I invite you to reflect on the lands that you are joining on from today. This webinar is rooted in the findings of our Digital Access Report, a national snapshot of what's working, what's missing, and what's urgently needed when it comes to digital access for Indigenous entrepreneurs. The findings are clear. 89% of respondents say that reliable internet is essential, but many still don't have it. Barriers include cost, training gaps, infrastructure, and tools that don't reflect Indigenous realities. This isn't just about technology. It's about economic self-determination, equity, and leadership on Indigenous terms. We're joined today by two incredible panelists who both have lived experience and institutional insight into today's discussion. James Delorme is an Indigenous digital and social disruptor and the former chief of Clahous First Nation. He brings deep leadership experience grounded in Indigenous knowledge and cultural safety. Today, he serves as CEO of the Indigenous Infrastructure Fund Corporation and sits on the TELUS Indigenous Advisory Council, where he champions innovative, community-led digital strategies. Marissa Neubauer is the Director of Reconciliation, Community Engagement, and External Relations at TELUS. She leads a team that builds strategic partnerships with Indigenous governments and communities to expand broadband connectivity. Marissa was instrumental in establishing TELUS's Reconciliation Action Plan, the first of its kind in the tech sector in Canada, and it continues to guide TELUS's work towards reconciliation in action. I'm excited to dive into the discussion today with both of you. And Marissa, I'd love to start with this question. Why is this work so important to TELUS?
Thanks, Michelle, and I'm privileged to be here today. And we were talking earlier, and I'm on the very cold fall-like territory of the Coquitlam people here in Coquitlam. But the beauty of the rain and the cold is that when I look out my window, I see nothing but green. First off, I want to congratulate you on the launch of your digital access report. I've been reading it over the last couple of weeks, and what I really like about it is it clearly lays out very clear pathways to enable digital equity. It demonstrates the different roles everybody can play in enabling digital equity and closing the gap. And I think that when organizations and companies ask, what do we do, or what do our team members do, or what is our role in this, you've provided a great roadmap on where are the intersection points between what your business does and what these actions are saying, and where can you best support and help. And I think that is such a pivotal and important thing to be doing in this space. So my hands are raised to you. Congratulations. It's phenomenal. So why is it important to TELUS? I mean, I think at the end of the day, everybody recognizes that reliable, high-speed internet is key in 2025. It's key to participating fully in the digital economy. When you have connectivity, you can access critical services, you can access education, you can access healthcare, economic opportunities. Indigenous communities can revitalize culture. It supports self-determination. And really importantly, one of the key things that I've heard from within community is it allows people to move home. It allows people to move home back into community and stay in community. And that is such a beautiful opportunity. And we all know that when Indigenous communities are connected to high-speed internet, everybody benefits. Everybody benefits from Indigenous communities having connectivity. But in order to do that, we all need access to it. And we recognize that connectivity is pivotal, and it's a key pillar of our reconciliation strategy. As a telecommunications provider in Canada, we play a significant role in ensuring that we are connecting Indigenous communities to our advanced broadband networks. And what makes everything so diverse and beautiful about these lands that we live on is also quite often what makes it so difficult to connect everybody. So as an organization, we recognize, what is the role that we have to play in this? How can we partner with Indigenous communities to connect them to advanced broadband network, right? It's challenging. It's expensive to build the infrastructure. It's expensive for the ongoing OpEx costs of maintaining that infrastructure, things that you've talked about in your report. And so we need to approach this in partnership. We need to partner with Indigenous communities to understand what their specific needs are, as every community has unique needs when it comes to connectivity. Some communities are really looking at ownership. Some communities want to be just have an ISP in their community. And some communities wouldn't want, for example, a traditional connectivity. They would want wireless because of potential impacts of pole lines in their community. Everybody wants something different. So one of the great things about this work is our ability to partner with Indigenous communities and look at regions and going, how can we all work together to connect communities to the connectivity that makes sense and works? And that means sitting down with communities, engaging, understanding the technology types, understanding their objectives, and making sure that when we're looking at it in an economy of scale, right? We're ensuring that we aren't creating gaps by just doing one community, that we're doing a comprehensive regional connectivity plan. And then from there, we sit down and we go to the federal government, the Universal Broadband Fund you discussed in your report, the government of BC's Connecting Communities Fund, and we collectively go together and apply for funding to be able to connect communities. Those partnerships are essential. Without the different partnerships, none of us can succeed. And, I'm really proud of the work we've done to date in our serving area, which is BC, Alberta, and a portion of Quebec. We've connected 89% of the homes, communities, and small businesses and government buildings in Indigenous communities to our advanced broadband network. Over $122 million invested, and this year we're investing an additional $22 million to connect an additional 20 communities. I recognize, though, there's still lots more work to do. There's many more communities that need connecting, especially really hyper rural and remote communities. And there's a lot of work that we need to do together. But I think that's the key word in it. We need to do it together, and we need to explore the different options, connectivity solutions, and community plans to be able to do it. So it's a privilege to be able to do this work, and I'm really excited about the outcomes that it is enabling in community.
Awesome. Thanks, Marissa. And I love that you touched on, that ability for people to move home, to be in their own communities. I'm originally from a rural and remote community. That's a huge challenge. And I've done a lot of work with Northern First Nations in particular over the last several years, consulting prior to taking this role. And we see that consistently as a barrier when it comes to access to jobs or even entrepreneurship, right? If you want to have access to e-commerce and some of these things, you have to be able to be connected in. You talked also about the importance of really understanding the unique needs of each community, and it isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. So with that, we know that trust is really important in building relationships to be able to understand the unique needs of each community, and TELUS has done a really great job with that. I'm wondering if you have any advice to other institutions looking to build those meaningful reciprocal relationships.
I think at the end of the day, there's no shortcut. I think that's the big thing. People are always looking for shortcuts. There is no shortcut. Relationships take time to build, and regardless of whether or not you're dating somebody and considering marrying them or making new friends, it takes work, it takes effort, it takes time, and you need to respect that. You need to respect that it's going to take effort and time. You need to respect the communities that you're engaging with and understand that each community is different. Each community has had different experiences with industry. Each community has different cultural protocols. Each community has different goals that they're trying to achieve, right? If you're going to meet with a community 6 hours from the nearest town, there's going to be very different goals and objectives than a community that's located right in an urban center, right? You need to engage each community as a unique, distinct community, and you need to take the time to learn. You need to take the time to listen, and you need to take the time to build that relationship, and you can't rush it. I think the other thing is don't assume. What's that old adage? Assuming makes an ass out of you and me. It's so silly, but it's so true. you never know what is important to a community until you sit down and you have the conversation. I think the other thing that we always need to remember as well is that you're going to screw up. Building relationships is human work, and humans are inherently, fallible people. We mess up all the time, and it's okay. It's okay to mess up. It's not that you mess up, it's how you respond to somebody saying, "Hey, actually this," or "Hey, have you thought about this?" Right? So it's how you react to the mistakes that you make, how you listen, how you enter that conversation, and where you go from there. And then lastly, I just want to touch on, as an organization, you can have the best people on the ground working with communities, working with people, building relationships, but it needs to be inherently backed by what your corporate commitment to Indigenous peoples are, right? At the end of the day, people need to know that this is just not a really nice person that wants to do this because it's the right thing. They need to know that the corporation or the organization inherently supports and understands this work. So you need to know what your corporate relationship is to reconciliation. What is your commitment to reconciliation? How is the corporation responding to 94 calls to action, 231 calls for justice, UNDRIP, right? So that everybody can see what your overarching commitments are, and that this is not just a one-off. This is throughout, embedded within your organization.
Very, very well said. I think that transparency and understanding of the corporate kind of priorities is incredibly important. And you led the development of the Reconciliation Action Plan. TELUS has named reconciliation as a strategic priority for the organization moving forward. And I guess, what does that actually mean in practice? Like, how does that impact how you show up differently today as a corporation, and then your folks on the ground as well?
It's such a big question to answer. I think what it means, so I think there's a couple of pieces. So, TELUS started building their strategy in 2000. There are we. Our strategy in 2020, excuse me. Before that, we've been engaging with Indigenous peoples through our social purpose programs, Internet for Good, Mobility for Good, or through connectivity, but we didn't have that cohesive strategy, right? So we actually spent a good 18 months building out that strategy, engaging with leaders from across the country, elders, to understand where the intersection points were between what TELUS does and what Indigenous peoples were wanting to see from us, right? So we went through those frameworks of reconciliation I just mentioned. We engaged, but we also engaged internally, right? We did multiple layers of engagement because we also need to know where are TELUS's abilities to support reconciliation? What are our leaders thinking? What are our Indigenous team members thinking? How do we make sure that we're properly embedding this commitment into our organization? And that takes work not only externally, but internally as well. As anybody going through therapy will know, it takes a lot of introspection to be able to change perspectives and beliefs on how you've always done things. So we spent a lot of time doing that. We spent a lot of time at the base level. What is reconciliation? Why is this important? Why are the 94 calls to action important? What is the shared history of this country that we're all living on and working on today? So building out that knowledge base so that people internally really understood what it was. And then from there, we said, okay, my team can't own reconciliation at TELUS. We can support it, we can work, but at the end of the day, in order to actually be successful, every part of the business needs to embed reconciliation into it. You need to understand, what are the intersection points between reconciliation and our legal team? What are the intersection points between reconciliation and our real estate team? You name it. And so we actually took that approach, and I have, I don't know, 25 different VP areas from across the business that have leads that are supporting in implementing, integrating reconciliation into their business. So today, what happens is, in our real estate team, they say, you know what, we're going to be updating our buildings as part of our commitment to reconciliation. What can we do as a party? We can integrate Indigenous placekeeping as we remodel our buildings. We can procure from Indigenous vendors in the work that we do, right? So everybody has a role to play. And to me, that is what I see in practice, is different business units learning, listening, updating, changing, and engaging as they go.
Yeah, that's incredible. Thanks for walking us through that process. I think starting with that basis and foundation of truth and getting everyone to a shared understanding is such an important first step. It's really easy to move on to reconciliation, right? We always want to get to the action side of things, but if you don't have that strong foundation as a starting point, it's really difficult to get there. And then really allowing people to consider how it impacts their respective departments, and think differently about the work that they do. So really beautifully said. Thanks so much, Marissa. I'm going to now turn it over to James. James, you've been on the front lines of these issues for years. So from your perspective, what is missing in how mainstream providers approach digital access with Indigenous communities, and especially those in remote areas?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle, and nice to follow up with Marissa because really she's the guiding light of the work that really needs to be done and TELUS in general. James Delorme, a member of Cluhus First Nation. Relatives are actually from Treaty 4 territory. So dad's from Cowessess, and my Mosham's from Cowessess, and my Kokum's from Kakawistau. Also Scottish and Icelandic, so Indigenous Viking. Wonderful to be part of this discussion. And to answer that question, there's a lot of connectors that will answer it, Michelle. And I think it goes back to what the data sets that have been created here. And what I mean by that is the digital access report that was created by your organization, Indigenous Prosperity, really sets the tone. And it helps when Marissa was talking about those connectors of how to actually be doing that TRC work in community. Well, it's data sets that have been lacking over the years. And so those data sets that have been created, and especially this one, it clearly shows some of the pathways that are really good examples. So I just start there as to answer it, give it some context, because it's hard for folks to really understand what the complexities are that Marissa had created and greatly messaged in their story and her commitments. It's really hard to explain that in a short period of time. But what I will say is that at that larger scale, it's investment, investment and trust. So TELUS, and I don't mind, I'm a bit biased because I'm also Indigenous Advisory Council member for TELUS. So I help guide in their process along with some other Indigenous leaders. Really wonderful to be a part of that. So what I want to say though is that it's really important for industry to understand that the complexities of what our communities represent. And I go back to the 90s. Just give you some history. I posted on LinkedIn this morning to give that audience a greater context that it really is a transformation with these technologies. They're really important to understand. But it comes down to the trust. It comes down to what you said, Michelle, is how is that trust being relayed in the community? There's some clear examples I'll talk about maybe later in our call here, but it's really people on the ground that are going to make the difference. And so when companies are investing, as TELUS has done with the Indigenous Advisory, and then all the subsequent programs that they have, which are vast in efforts. So when you see a company that's doing that, and you start to take inventory of what those are, you start to realize that there is some activity that's taking place. And one thing that a lot of people say to me is on that pathway of Indigenous reconciliation, they're a little bit worried about amplifying their efforts. And what I say as an Indigenous person myself, as my background, a former chief, as you mentioned, I actually I give them the platform to do that, to amplify it, to be proud of what you're doing. We're proud of us as individuals, as community members. We're proud of the work that we do in our communities. And so we want to see that more in the industry, and we want to see people taking that step forward to be true allyship. And then you can go down the road of investment. You can go down that road like TELUS has, is investing in various projects and programs and partnerships that are going to really critically change the landscape for the lessening that digital divide. And it's huge. The landscape's huge. Let's be honest here, folks. We're in a really tough situation. We have generative AI that's really ruling the day. But these are tools, folks. And what we need to do is make sure that trust is there, that there's a connectivity, as Marissa mentioned, and that's essential for everything, all ecosystems, whether it's tech, whether it's business, whether it's social development. They all have a common theme, and that is that connectivity. So I'm a big 5G spectrum fan, and I work in the industry as well. So I'm always going to be promoting that connectivity. but it's really the folks on the ground. And one staff member I'm going to highlight today is Susie Houlet in Northern Alberta. Amazing. And that's what it really takes for industry to have folks like her doing the work in community, understanding the chiefs and the councils, but also understanding the grassroots folks.
Awesome. There's so many different threads I could pull on through there, but I want to keep us on track. You talked about AI. I had the opportunity to be part of a Globe and Mail roundtable around AI and Indigenous communities last week, and we talked a lot about like creating cultural alignment around digital solutions and tools, and how digital infrastructure as well is so critical moving forward, and also if we don't have access to these things, communities are going to fall behind, and that becomes really challenging. You also talked about, the TELUS's Indigenous Advisory Council, and I think that that's one way in which they're looking at cultural alignment for digital solutions. And I'm wondering, in your perspective, what does that look like in community?
Well, actually, I was just asked this question last week, very specifically, Michelle. So it's really timely. And one of the things, and this came from a colleague, Indigenous colleague, and they asked basically the same question. And they said, "Well, your role, James, is great. Wonderful. Congratulations. It's amazing. What you can do with in the tech sector, and especially with a telco. But what is the impact? How does that actually benefit?" And one of the things that I'm going to highly recommend as one of those markers that gives you some indication or an idea of what the impact is the co-chair. We have the co-chair is integral part of not only our group, but he's also he's a board member on TELUS. So having somebody Indigenous, someone we know and trust, Sean Willie is his name, who's in the business world, and please Google him. Having him, helping the conversations, supporting that Indigenous Council, Advisory Council, it just really helps the rest of us feel at home and have a connection. Now, the other piece that's really important is the ability to speak truthfully and freely. And never at any point is there any direction that we're pointed in or that we're maybe used in what they typically call a tokenism. That's not part of the work. The work is true and honest, and it comes by very sincere. And so I have a privilege of working on this council, this advisory, to actually impact, because I bring my relatives along with me. I often say that to folks, is we bring ancestors into the room when we speak our language. So I'm going to say something. Imot samsquagan kochu kapi nishtes geje. So when we bring language into the room, when we bring our ancestors into the room, then we have the ability to bring the Indigenous lens completely full circle. And so it's important for us to have that Indigenous lens, and that is the connector. It's language, it's culture, it's our point of views. It's not our individual points of view, it's how our communities are interacting with each other. And as Marissa noted, that there's a lot of complexities, and we have to recognize those. But as clearly stated, wonderful territorial recognition, those are very important foundational pieces. But we also need to bring in the Indigenous lens with our culture and language and ensure that continues on. And that's up to our elders and our teachers who guide us in that process.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing that. And yeah, incredibly powerful to have that representation on the board as well, to have somebody sitting on the committee, but then also being able to be that voice in the room, and share those messages. And I think those stories are incredibly important, right? We tried to gather a lot of stories in our report and share those voices, because at the end of the day, it is important that Indigenous perspectives are heard, that it's understood. I think sometimes, those of us who live in urban settings don't really understand the challenges, especially in some of these rural and remote communities. And some actually aren't that far out. I think about, I was in Ottawa last year, and we made a trip out to Kittigan-Zibi, and on the way, it's an hour and a half outside of Ottawa, but on our way out there, I had no service. And it blew my mind, because I think about, I'm from Saskatchewan originally, I live in Alberta. So I know in lots of our northern rural and remote communities, that's the challenge, but that's not necessarily, it's not always that far from the larger urban centers. So, we heard about people having to drive into town just to get a bar of signal. And, how do you connect? How do you work? How do you compete when that's the case? So thank you so much for sharing that. Marissa, I want to maybe shift from big picture into some kind of practical action pieces. So how is TELUS moving from transactional service to meaningful relationship building in Indigenous communities? And you did talk about it a little bit, but I'm wondering if you could expand with some examples for us.
Yeah, I'd like to do a couple of examples because I think to James's point, there's so many different layers to this conversation, right? There's that strategy layer that we're talking about, the IAC level, and I'll give you an example that came out of the conversation and actually speaks to how much this work is constantly shifting and changing. So 4 years ago, I'm losing track of days and times. We sat down with the advisory councils, our very first advisory council meeting, and we're talking about how do we define Indigenous business, right? This is a hot topic. There's lots of conversations about it. And we got some very clear, specific feedback from the advisory council. As a result of the advisory council, we completely revamped the way in which we were defining and looking at Indigenous businesses to ensure that we were taking an appropriate and inclusive approach. Fast forward 4 years. Our last advisory council meeting, we were talking about it again and where we were. And one of the items coming out of it was question. And as a result of that, we're evolving it again, right? Because I think what it really does is it shows how it evolves over time, how things change over time. A couple of other things that I wanted to talk about is, when you think about shifting from service delivery to relationships, right? How are we actually doing that? What does that actually mean on the ground? I think it's really important to note that as an organization, if I were to take my customer solutions team, so that's the team that's in the homes, installing, fixing, those are the community members that are in community on the ground all the time, working with community members. And they need to be building relationships on the ground with community. So if I can take a couple of examples, during COVID, we all remember those days. Nobody knew what was happening. Connectivity in some communities was really sparse. Communities were scared of having people come in. So one of the things that our team members on the ground actually did, and this rolls back up to TELUS's broader commitment to give where we live, is worked with community members to understand how can we help you in this time, right? We were able to deliver masks. We were able to deliver essential goods that rural and remote communities couldn't access because of COVID restrictions and fear of leaving community, right? So when we talk about service delivery versus relationships, service delivery is just going in, installing and leaving. Relationship building is working together in hard times and in good, and supporting communities where they need it, when they need it. And those relationships don't end. The same communities that we supported with from a COVID perspective, a couple of years later, there's a massive fire, right? During the fires, people are evacuated from their homes. How do we support during those times? Cooks Ferry First Nations, one community where we actually set up a fiber line in a completely different reserve so that their community government continued to have access to connectivity when their other community was evacuated because of fire, right? So it's about understanding the needs and being there during times where not everything is hunky-dory and supporting through of that. So those are a couple of things. And then one of the other things I wanted to share is with respect to just building. At the end of the day, we need to, when we do our work on the ground, when we're working in communities, we need to look at this as a benefit to everybody, right? I think quite often when companies go into community, it's like, well, I want to build this, and how do I do it the way that I want to do it? We need to reframe that. We need to think about the fact that communities have lived on the ground since time immemorial, and they understand the land. They understand where everything goes much better. A community can tell you if an area floods and where not to put things, right? It's a benefit to you. It's a benefit to the community. And so Conklin Métis actually is one community I want to talk about. So Conklin Métis is in northern Alberta. We were doing a large fiber build in the Wood Buffalo Regional District with funding partnerships with that regional district municipality, which include connecting Conklin Métis. In conversations with Conklin Métis, and James called it Susie, one of the things that came up was there was unmarked burial grounds in the community. But they didn't exactly know where they were, but they knew it was around the area where the fiber line was proposed to go. And so we actually worked with them to support some ground penetrating radar to understand where they were so that we could reroute the fiber line in an area that didn't impact them, but then also at the same time the community now knows where those sites are, right? It's these ways of sitting down, learning, understanding, working together that have allowed us to both connect communities but also respond to the needs. So those are just a couple of examples of how, you know, I've seen real shifts on the ground through the work we do.
Yeah, wow. I mean, and a lot of that, you know, a lot of corporations might say that's not our job, that's not what we do, right? Whether it's delivering masks, that's outside of our mandate, but understanding the unique needs of the community, building trust and being able to be a strong partner, I think goes a really long way when you think about the long-term relationship. You kind of touched on this, but I'm going to ask it in case you have anything else you want to add. You know, are there any examples of where TELUS maybe changed direction or made a decision based on Indigenous feedback? You know, we've heard about the Indigenous Advisory Council. We've heard about working more collaboratively in community. You know, you just gave a great example of recognizing that there were unmarked burial grounds that you needed to reroute around. But are there any others you maybe want to highlight?
There's so many, and that's the joy of this work, right? The joy of this work is and the great thing about this work is that you're constantly learning, constantly changing, constantly doing different things. So maybe I'll change course just a little bit and talk about a partnership with NISCA, because I think it's really cool, and it really speaks to the how do you work together to achieve outcomes that benefit both communities. So NISCA, First Modern Treaty Nation in the northwest of BC here, and one of the things that NISCA approached us with was how do they own the assets in their treaty lands? That was really important to them. It was a priority. It was a priority to NISCA as part of their sovereignty, goals. Also, priority for them was not was ensuring that anybody traveling through their treaty lands was safe. And so we worked with NISCA for about 18 months to go, how do we make this work? We'd never done this before. This was new to us. How can we figure out a way to make this work? And at the end of the day, and we're actually just all the towers are kind of coming up this year, is we were able to align on a first of its kind where TELUS built the infrastructure. NISCA owns the passive asset. So NISCA actually owns the towers on the land. And we're currently in the process of training, or over the coming years, training the NISCA ISP LITs to support the maintenance of those towers, to learn how to work on co-locating if somebody wants to join the tower. So that has been such a cool project to work on, because NISCA had a very specific want and a very specific need, and we were able to work together that worked for both parties. And I think the long-term benefit of this as well is LITS has actually been able to add additional FTEs, or full-time employees, into the community, into the ISP to support long-term employment, right? So there's a lot of benefits that are coming out of this, along the fact that all NISCA villages and portions of the highway are now connected to wireless connectivity.
Yeah, it's a great example, and just really encouraging to hear about some of those shifts. You know, it's not just in policy, but really in practice, and you see it play out. Awesome. So maybe we'll look ahead. And a question that, you know, certainly I think those who are connected with us at the Indigenous Prosperity Foundation would be interested in is, and for both of you, how do we move from providing access to building long-term capacity, especially around things like digital skills, entrepreneurship, and innovation? And maybe we'll start with James.
No, thanks. Thanks for that opportunity to speak on that. That's it hits home actually. Those are really key pieces that are need attention, not yesterday or sorry, not tomorrow, but today. Yesterday is come and gone. And but I quickly want to touch base on that one use case. I say use case because I come from industry. It's the community of NISCA and what that means for that connectivity. And let's use that as an example. And maybe we could dive into that a little bit more in this answering that question. In that general sense, in that high level, really amazing. And by the way, when I first heard about this, I had to keep it under wrap. It was, you know, I was under NDA and I couldn't talk about these things, but I had an idea of what this meant. And as a person who's involved with connectivity, it just was groundbreaking that Modern Treaty Nation could own that asset and actually take that asset and do some pretty amazing, important pieces of communication. And it's actually healthier outcomes. That's what I use. I use that phrase, healthier outcomes. So on that model, there's some key things that are going to take place. And obviously, you need some training, you need capacity building, getting your community members up to speed on what these jobs could take place. There's various, I don't want to get into details on what those might be. That's up to them. However, from my own industry knowledge, I can say clearly that there's many different places where skilled trades, skilled technicians are really important to have. But it's also how do we embrace uh, training opportunities that are happening for them. So you have to tie into some folks that here in BC are micro certification. So there's a lot of different ways that different provinces are using for getting certified to become, say, a technician or be a part of a tech solution. But under the NISCA model that was quoted here with TELUS, obviously there's an opportunity for that community to tie into, say, the First Nations Technology Council and some of the training that they offer. Then there's other organizations that are in the sector already. There's a lot of small companies that are already talking about, SEO and internet connectivity, digital arts. We go into more progressive technologies. There's a lot of different companies, organizations that are paving the way for training opportunities for young people to enter into those sectors. So when it comes to, say, a project like NISCA is undertaking with those clear partnerships that have been successful, now we can get into that conversation of how do you actually build that capacity. Maybe it's the NISCA people themselves that are creating that opportunity. And maybe it's a partnership with other community, neighboring nations that could do that work. But there's been a set standard. FNTC's led the way, and they have some really great people that are doing that work. Now we need to do that even more. We need to get other folks involved that are going to lead the way for mentoring, supporting young people and even elders so they can understand, they can get back to that trust issue. We can talk about how it's not just economic development opportunities, it's the ability to have a career, it's ability to change within those careers, interoperable. And it's also to be able to be part of that tech sector that in your report, it clearly states that there's a deficiency. And so these are prime, the data sets are clearly connectors. And now we can look at how, say, a nation can actually enter into that area where their members are participating. So I'll give one example where you can see some legs. So I'm an A+ certified technician, but Microsoft, and but that's not my. I'm not into that. I'm not into building computers. I'm into talking about technology. So, but there's IT teams that we need. We need more A+ certification. We need more folks that are IT ready. They call it IMIT, so information management, information technology. We have a whole scope of different jobs, careers that are just opening for Indigenous participation. And so I'm just going to list you some folks that are really in the industry that are, and Darian Kovacs with Jelly Academy, really great training authority, doing some amazing work. I think about Shaw First Nations, Rob and Chelsea, amazing to highlight small businesses and what they're doing, Indigenous businesses. There's Cherish Lynn in Lynn Rose in Yellowknife. Sorry, I apologize. Whitehorse Territories, Yukon. She's amazing. I've been following her for years, and technology-wise, she's a developer. So there's a lot of examples of development teams. There's a lot of examples of Indigenous folks that are technicians, that are developers, that are in the industry. And we need to make sure that they're connected to communities and that we're all doing this together in partnership. In my opinion.
I love that you mentioned Darian and Jelly Marketing. I'm actually heading out to Vancouver to meet with him tomorrow. We've done some work with him on our Launchpad program, which we launched 2 weeks ago at the NACA forum, and they've just been absolutely incredible. So a great shout out there amongst the others that you mentioned. Thanks for that, James. Marissa, would you like to add anything to that?
I mean, James got so much, but maybe I'll provide a couple comments. So I think, James, you hit the nail on the head, right? It needs to be co-created. We need to work together with Indigenous organizations like FNTC around the work that they're doing. There's so many amazing organizations doing amazing work today. It's about finding the right partners for the work that you're doing. And so I want to call it like an example of one of the things that we're doing. And so out of the great list, I think one of the ones that we have partnered with is Plato. So Plato is an Indigenous-led organization that does software testing and really focuses on supporting Indigenous people to build capacity in the technology space. And it's really, I really like it because it's really centered on reciprocity, and Plato plays a huge role in working with companies, providing a service to companies, but also at the same time building up capacity within individuals so that those individuals can then go on and get full-time jobs elsewhere. And some of the stats that Plato and Denis has shared with me around training, but then long-term employment are phenomenal. But one of the things that we've done with Plato is a big thing that TELUS does is called purple teaming. So what we want to do is we want to test our AI tools to make sure that they are being used appropriately, to make sure that the answers are right, to make sure that you can't break it, for lack of a better term. There's my non-technical way of explaining purple teaming. But one of the things that we did with Plato is support. Plato came in and actually did purple teaming on TELUS's AI. So TELUS has an AI called Fuel IX. And they actually came in and they did purple teaming on it, worked with our team members to see how they could break it. And it was mutually beneficial to everybody. Number one, TELUS was able to understand some vulnerabilities within our AI. We're also able to understand some vulnerabilities in the way the program was talking about Indigenous people. And I'll talk about that in a second. On the flip side of it too, Plato was able to generate a new business growth area, right? They were able to train these individuals so that they're now able to go out as an Indigenous business and provide this skill set elsewhere. And on top of that, you have the individuals that now have learned skills in working in the AI space, which, as we all know, is that fourth industrial revolution that we're all trying to figure out right now. So there's so many layers to that partnership. I think on top of just coming back to the comment I made about AI and goes back to that co-creating piece of it, we also need to understand that the tools, and I think you talk about this in your report around what lack of Indigenous cultural ways of knowing and being integrated in the tools, we also need to recognize and understand that in the tools that we have today, are those tools appropriate? Are those tools actually supporting Indigenous peoples and entrepreneurs in the way they want? And so one of the things that we've been working on, and it's still quite nascent because this area is still quite new, is how do we ensure that we're incorporating Indigenous perspectives into our AI? So what role do we have to incorporate Indigenous perspectives into our AI engine? So we started off by first saying, we will not use AI to replicate Indigenous art. We made that commitment last year, and it was really important to us to say we will not do this. But then on top and then part of it too, so other individuals and organizations also understand that they need to take a stand on it. But that's base layer. What we really are been working on over the last year and a half is engaging with Indigenous peoples from across the country, talking to OCAT, FNIGC, folks like James, and really understanding what is Indigenous data, how do we incorporate Indigenous perspectives into our AI engine, what are the gaps with our AI engine, and really working alongside Shawnee Gwynn, who is also based in Edmonton, and how can we build our AI tools to be inclusive of an Indigenous perspective, working with her, Wasi Khan, and trying to figure that out. And we're still trying to figure it out, but I share it because I think it's really important not to just talk about when it's successful and when it launches, but how much work goes into it in the background to think about these things, to make sure that the AI that you're using is not spitting out in uninformed positions on Indigenous people, leveraging what there is on the internet, right? And on the flip side, making sure we're giving right credit. So that was a lot of things that I was talking about, but to me, it's the yes and of it. We need to be working right now to build out digital skills and partnering and co-creating with Indigenous peoples and organizations. But at the same time, we need to make sure that the tools that we may be developing or using are also being co-created in a way that benefit Indigenous peoples and are aligned with cultural ways of knowing. And it's a lot of work with no defined answer.
Yeah, thank you for digging into that, because it is something we recognize in our report. It's something I see all the time working with Indigenous entrepreneurs and communities. And I think, a huge opportunity that you identified in working with Indigenous youth and entrepreneurs in designing or co-creating digital tools and systems that will help to shape their future. You've kind of taken that on already, but I'm interested in maybe, James, if you have a perspective around that you'd like to share, in addition to what Marissa has shared with us.
Yeah, thanks. I'll keep it brief, and I'll just say what I see now is incredible. And my perspective on AI tools is very simple. It's a tool, and but it's human centric. So these tools, though, we need to understand and have the ability to manifest it into things that are going to benefit us. And so, whether it's you're an entrepreneur or you're a community person, wherever you are in your life and your journey, it's in the context of the digital divide, we it's the ability to know that you have a journey to learn and the ability to you have opportunity. And so it's connecting folks that are already in that. So Plato, really good example. There's some folks all over Canada, many folks compared to back in the 90s, talking to old guy here. We've seen some innovation and people embracing technology. So the chance for youth to be into that, to be part of that, is never at its greatest moment. And it's up to us as mentors that we invite that and we bring you in. And that's the important piece, is bring you in so you can be a part of that process.
And I muted myself. I'm cognizant of time, and I do recognize that we started a little bit late. I do want to make it possible for people to ask any questions. So we do have a Q&A chat. I've seen a couple of things come in there that were kind of quick responses. But if you have any additional questions, please feel free to use that. We do have a few minutes to answer those. And I mean, truly bright, inspiring, incredible panelists here. So we want to be able to pick their brains, hear what's happening. I've learned so much just in our short 1 hour today. I feel like we could have kept this going all afternoon. Many follow-up discussions, I'm sure, that will happen. Maybe to kind of kick us off, and we've touched on it a little bit, but I'd love to dig in a little bit further. What role do you think traditional knowledge systems and digital innovation play together? I think sometimes we look at those two things at maybe being like at odds with one another, and I'd love to hear how you've seen that play out or your vision for that.
Well, okay, Marissa's giving me the nod. Yeah, that's a I think that's essential to the Indigenous lens. And really, quite honestly, it goes without saying. It should. It doesn't, unfortunately, because the sector itself doesn't lend into the Indigenous lens. It's really tough to actually bring those traditional pieces. So a lot of ways that have happened is there's Indigenous people that have created, say, a VR platform where they're storytelling, and so that's a really good way to bridge those two together. However, it's having those knowledge keepers, if you don't mind me using knowledge keepers, in the conversations. So typically, I think in tech conversations, they're the last to know. And it's amazing that even my own biases, I'm privileged myself, my own knowledge base, that I don't include other people. And all of a sudden I'm surprised that, and I shouldn't be, but I'm surprised that that elder actually knows more about the technology in the ecosystem sense, the IAM sense, than I realized. So it's really breaking down the biases that really open the door for others to participate. And we need them. We need to bring them in because, as I mentioned, our ancestors bring them into the room. Our elders are knowledge keepers, and they will guide us.
I think we have more in common than we don't. And that's where I always start with. At the end of the day, 99.9% of people want the same thing. They want clean water. They want healthy families. They want to be happy. And I think that if we can all come together and understand at that basic level and have mutual respect to that basic level, those differences, the difference in perspectives and cultural lenses, just adds to the richness of the conversation and creates such different conversations. Nobody wants to have a conversation with somebody that looks and talks like themselves. You don't learn anything from that. You don't grow. And I think that there's a lot of fear that comes out of opening these conversations. And if we could all just kind of go back to basics, to go, we're all basically the same. We all basically want the same things, and we have different perspectives, and those different perspectives don't have to be conflicting, right? They actually work together better than I think we realize. We just need to put the fear aside and sit down and have those conversations, have the elders at the table, have the youth at the table. It's actually one of the big reasons that we have 2 youth advisors in our advisory council. The elders said to us, the youth need to be at the table. They are the future. So I think that if we all put a little bit of our ego and a little bit of our fear aside, we would be very successful.
Very well said. And I mean, certainly as a national organization that serves Indigenous women, youth, and early stage entrepreneurs for coast to coast to coast, we look at how we can leverage technology to meet those needs, and it's a pivotal part of our strategy moving forward. So I love that you've hit on a lot of these pieces. One of the things that we've done is we have a Money Smarts board game that's focused on financial literacy to tap into youth and get them prepared. And we have a physical board game, which is wonderful, but we also created an online tool because we recognize that not everyone's going to have access or a group to play that game with, but they can go through it on their own in that way. And we're optimizing it for, our mobile devices right now, because we also recognize that, young people are primarily on their phones, not on their laptops, right? And so we have to be responsive to that, but it brings traditional knowledge and, it was co-created with community. So I think that's one way that we can kind of leverage traditional knowledge and digital innovation to meet the needs. And I love that focus on storytelling and culture and language. I think there's so many incredible things that are going to happen as we continue to move forward with advances around technology and AI. We are coming to a close, so I want to be respectful of everybody's time. This was just a truly incredible conversation. Like I said, I could talk to you both all day. But I do want to maybe leave you with this. The report that we developed it's not just a reflection of barriers. It is a testament to the brilliance, resilience, and readiness of Indigenous entrepreneurs. It's both a mirror and a map. With committed partners like TELUS walking alongside us, we have the opportunity to move from insight to impact, and I hope today's provided you with a little bit of that. Thank you to both James and Marissa, and to everyone who joined us today. This is a recorded webinar, so it will be available on our YouTube page afterwards, so you can share it out. Thank you to TELUS for your continued commitment to reconciliation through action. The path forward for Indigenous-led innovation and tech is clearly mapped out, and I know we're going to learn a lot of things as we continue to move forward and need to be responsive to that, but we're really grateful for this opportunity to walk it together. So as we move forward, I hope that we have better access and understand our shared responsibilities, and we leave here with a renewed commitment to digital equity and on Indigenous terms. So thank you again. Despite starting a little bit late, we are ending on time. It was, again, wonderful, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon and rest of their week.
Thank
you. This is wonderful.
Thank you.